welcome all of you to our colloquium today. I want to actually acknowledge a couple of institutional affiliates that have co-sponsored this event. One is the Department of Sociology here at University of California at Berkeley, and the other is the Center for Advanced Study of Aging and Services. So we certainly want to thank them. Now I want to, before I talk, to give some preliminaries about the format. Our speaker today will address this for about 45 minutes. And after that period of time, it'll be open up for discussion. Those of you who are joining us via Zoom can enter your questions in the Q&A box and at any time while the discussion is going on, and I will ask those questions later on your behalf. Now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, and you'll know why in a minute. Our speaker is Professor Stacy Torres, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of California in San Francisco. She received her PhD in sociology from New York University, and then came to UC Berkeley as a President's Postdoc Fellow. And while in that capacity, she was in residence here at the Center for Ethnographic Research. So that's one of the reasons that I'm happy about introducing her and having her return to us. She's been affiliated with the center ever since her time as a postdoctoral fellow. She's the author of numerous articles and is here today to talk with us about her recently published book entitled At Home in the City, Growing Old in Urban America, which is published by the University of California Press. The title of her presentation today is How to Make a Home in the City. Please join me in welcoming Professor Torres.
Thank you so much. Is the mic on? Is that working well? All right. I really appreciate everybody who could make it today in the room and on Zoom. So thanks for being here. The book took a long time. As I tell my students, you're going to live and breathe this project for many years, as I did, but I'm excited to share what I learned with you. So I often think of the Talking Heads song, Once in a Lifetime, when I think about my life or this book. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of background first about how did I get here? This is a song where it's like, this is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful life. Like, how did I get here? So I thought it might be helpful to tell you a little bit about me. And then I would tell you a little bit about how I found my research subjects, or rather how they found me. So first of all, I grew up in New York City. That's the site where I conducted my research. I grew up in Manhattan. I often tell people on the West Coast who may not be as familiar with New York City, I grew up in the shadow of the Empire State Building in Chelsea. And I grew up working class, and I was the very first person in my family to go to college. So I was already something of an outsider, I feel, for a lot of my early years, probably still too. I was very shy and socially awkward, as I still am. And so I always felt like I was on the fringes, on the outside looking in, which I guess has served me well in my research and my life as an ethnographer. I'm also the daughter of an immigrant from Chile, and he worked as an elevator operator when they had those, and then later a doorman. My mother worked as a secretary. And because nobody went to college, it took me quite a while to figure out how the gifts that they gave me and their talents really set the stage and the foundation for my research as an ethnographer later in my own life. My father had exquisite powers of observation, and he loved to point out, in his words, the weird people that he saw on the streets of New York City. And there were a lot of things for him to see, lots of interesting people, the way that they were dressed, they talked, etc., lots of diversity. He also was an incredible storyteller, and he would tell us about the interactions he had with all these people that lived in his building, his tenants that he served as an elevator operator and a doorman. My mother, the lifelong secretary, was constant note taker, record keeper, and journal writer. And so later, years later, after she passed away, I unearthed all of these like sepia toned journals that she had kept since she was in her 20s. And then even when she had us kids, and I'm the eldest of four girls, and she didn't have the time to journal anymore as deliberately, I found all of her notes in the margins of just different, on the backs of like bank envelopes. So she was always writing. I too have a humanities background, and I studied comparative literature in college. And afterwards, I earned an MFA in creative nonfiction writing. And so I really tried to write this as pleasantly and as accessibly as I could. But those early sort of forays into writing, and especially memoir writing, I felt that I needed to kind of learn how to tell my own story first before I told somebody else's. Then I stuck it in a drawer and haven't done anything with it since. So maybe now that this book is out, I'll be able to return to that. But storytelling and literature were my entree into studying the social world. So how I found my subjects, I think, is an interesting story, but it's not one that's uncommon to people who study aging within sociology, aging in the life course. I actually never intended to study older people. I would often joke, coming from my working class background, that a lot of people in my life didn't live very long. In my family, my mother passed away at 52. My grandfather on her side passed away at 50. So, I would say we leave a good corpse, in my gallows, humor. But people didn't live long, and so experienced a lot of early loss. So I didn't have very strong relationships with grandparents or older adults in life. But what fascinated me at first was the place where my study began, which was a mom and pop bakery in New York City that had somehow survived gentrification. And so, as a lifelong New Yorker, I started going there as a customer before I started studying the place formally. I was shocked when I discovered La Marjolaine Patisserie, it was a French bakery, was still in business. It had been around since about 1962, which was ancient by New York standards. It was a dinosaur in my mind. And so this place that was this fossilized place sat nestled among three important residential swaths, a set of housing projects, public housing projects, low equity co-ops that had been built in the 60s, and market rate apartments that still housed a sizable number of rent controlled and rent stabilized tenants. So you had a lot of people there that were of lower and modest incomes, still able to stay in the neighborhood. The place itself also kind of had a cozy, kind of an older feel. It had 8 tables arranged in a rectangle, so people could dip in and out of conversations going around them. They could kind of be on the sidelines, and like me, I was sort of the student in the corner working on trying to finish her MFA thesis. I could be there in the corner and then, oh, I'm sort of eavesdropping, hearing things, and insert myself in one of these conversations. The walls were butter colored, and they had these plastic kind of seasonal tablecloths, lent the place a cozy, if a little bit of a distressed feel. Distressed meaning, wasn't the high end, sleek, shiny place that people sometimes complained about the furniture, but with affection. And people dropped in several days a week, and sometimes multiple times a day. And they didn't even buy things sometimes. So I detail in the book how they really were they were given the freedom to make this place their own. But soon I started noticing the people more and more. And at this time, I was in my 20s, and I noticed that the place was not only old, but that it was filled with older New Yorkers. So people over the age of 60, but really largely in their 70s and 80s. And they were aging in place. And in gerontology lingo, just to try to make it simple, I mean, basically, they had stayed in their neighborhoods and their homes, and they were trying to stay there as long as they could independently. So they had had some people in their lives who had to transition to a retirement community or an assisted living facility. Other of their counterparts had moved down to Florida, but these people had stayed there for several decades. And in some cases, some people were lifelong residents and had lived there their entire lives. And so from this site, I recruited the elders who I'd spend the next 5 years conducting participant observations among at this location and other places scattered throughout the neighborhood when this bakery closed due to a lost lease. So they had to close, they weren't able to keep the business going. And then the older people had to reconfigure their daily routines and their relationships and try to find another place. And so to give you a peek into that last day, I figured I would read a short passage from the opening pages. So I was very proud that I could retain my epigraphs in the book because there was a little bit of legal going back and forth to make sure that I could do that under fair use. So I will read the epigraphs, which I think evoke some of the themes of the book regarding place and how people find place, make place, keep place. So the writer, Joan Didion, writes, "A place belongs forever to whoever claims it hardest, remembers it most obsessively, wrenches it from itself, shapes it, renders it, loves it so radically that he remakes it in his own image." And then another quotation that I've become quite fond of by the poet of California, Robertson Jeffers, upon seeing Carmel for the first time, who him and his wife actually aged in place in Big Sur, and they didn't know it at the time that they were going to spend so many decades of their lives there, wrote, "It was evident that we had come without knowing it to our inevitable place." We huddled at a corner table on the final day at La Marjolaine Patisserie, a mom and pop bakery on Manhattan's West Side. As snow curtained the windows, an icy February air tore through each time the door opened. Heavy flakes fell, and a little more of the place disappeared. A depleted stock of cakes and baked goods greeted customers. Sooty edges demarcated the ghostly outlines of pastry display cases that had sat for years on otherwise bright white floor tile. The butter-colored walls stood bare but for a leftover Valentine's Day wreath cradling two fuzzy teddy bears beneath the banner that read, "I love you." With a mischievous glint in his eyes, the owner said that he would leave it for the landlord. He had lost his lease after the landlord had sought a much higher monthly rent, and renewal negotiations had broken down that autumn. But despite everything, he hadn't lost his sense of humor about the bitter fight to keep his store open. Buyers for the equipment stripped the kitchen clean, and burly men soon arrived to remove commercial mixers and industrial ovens weighing over 1,000 pounds. They had been planted in the same spot for decades. I felt a twinge of disbelief as movers dismantled a place almost frozen in time, which until a few days before had seemed as enduring as the hulking trunk of a giant redwood tree or the base of the Empire State Building. Under ordinary circumstances, most people probably would have stayed home. Snowy sludge slicked the sidewalks, and many elder customers couldn't risk a fall. But neither snow nor rain nor gloom of night kept most regulars away on the bakery's last day of business. I saw many familiar faces, people I had met since becoming a customer 6 years before. Eugene sat in the corner. Though he'd proven stalwart on numerous occasions and had recently recovered from a second major hip surgery, his appearance still surprised me. Another longtime customer, Carmen, turned up despite a bad cold. "I had to come for the last day," she said, brushing snow from her shoulders and shaking off her black hat encrusted with ice. Red-nosed and sniffling, she clutched a balled-up tissue. Rather than trudge 2.5 blocks home, she took a cab back. Sylvia appeared at her usual time, around 10 a.m., and Lucy followed in the early afternoon. So this book became more more than just about the place where people found belonging, community, connection, somebody to listen to the trials and travails of life. But it became a study of older adults aging in place in New York City. And so in the chapters, I take up the various ways and I examine how they maintained independence in quotations, because who's truly independent, who truly doesn't have anybody else helping them out in life, how they maintained independence in the face of accumulated loss of friends, family, neighbor, lovers, gentrification, health setbacks that they experienced, depression, financial struggles, and everyday challenges. And the book really tries to examine how they cultivated the social support and belonging to a place and to others, whether that's family, friends, neighbors, and everyone in between. And so today, I've organized my remarks around the counterintuitive, sometimes counterintuitive ways that people made a home in the city. And so it's not the way that I suggest everybody should make a home in the city, but it was how the people in my study did. So we know belonging matters for older adults, but less about how, why, and what facilitates it. And so my book investigates the following questions. How do older people maintain their independence when faced with multiple vulnerabilities? What forms of social relationships exist? How do older people create or sometimes resist belonging? And in what ways does belonging to a place or a group help people manage crises and everyday challenges? In the book, I argue that we should devote greater attention to the neighborhood context where these informal bonds were able to blossom. And that I argue that they are especially crucial for older adults, given their need to not overstress kin networks, that's provided that they have them, given that they have surplus time in retirement for those who are privileged enough to stop working, and that they are spending, for many different reasons, more time closer to home. These relationships developed in public places may also allow older adults greater standing and recognition as something other than dependent, invisible, or a problem to solve. Alternative ties stand alongside and in some cases rival other structures critical to well-being in old age, such as family and home. So looking at some of the literature, isolation is often portrayed as a problem of old age due to risk factors such as living alone, physical illness, depression. All of these things can increase isolation risk. Um, Additionally, networks may shrink in late life due to different losses and also selective paring down and kind of trimming the branches of the social network. So reducing ties over time, as well as shifts like a move to a retirement community or assisted living facility, and the transition to retirement that changes routines and can diminish workplace contacts. But despite these challenges, the prevalence of isolation among the old really remains unclear. And research has also shown that older people face less loneliness and isolation than previously thought, and that social interaction and volunteering increase with age. But place does matter for sure, and place can rise in significance as older people are spending more time closer to their homes and in their neighborhoods due to retirement, dwindling finances, it's expensive to travel, and certain health problems that can limit travel outside of the neighborhood and even limit the radius of somebody has around their home due to issues with mobility and walking. So as older adults become less entrenched in institutions like work and family, they have to find ways to craft new routines and relationships. And so third places, such as bookstores, coffee shops, bakeries, the YMCA, parks, lots of different institutions that make up our social infrastructure, offer important spaces to socialize given some of those challenges. And potentially one of the only opportunities for social contact outside more formal settings where people receive services. So people may go to a doctor's office and a senior center where they're treated in one way, but they are kind of on the receiving end of services where this may be a more fluid and open space. And for people with vulnerabilities stemming from a lack of strong family support, material resources, cognitive declines, physical declines, I found that these neighborhood places were really important venues for people to avoid the isolation they may have experienced in other realms of their life. So a little bit about the study, and of course, I'm happy to answer any questions that come up in the Q&A with more detail. I spent 5 years conducting participant observations, and within the group of people I spent the most time with, I conducted 25 interviews. And the group of people that I did spend the most time with were roughly 47 men and women over the age of 60, mostly female or women, Puerto Rican, Jewish, ethnic white, so Italian, Greek, Irish descent, and low to middle income, reflecting the neighborhood demographics prior to significant gentrification. Oops. Another aspect of the neighborhood I would like to highlight is that it was a NORC. And so this funny acronym means naturally occurring retirement community. And so the majority of participants that I spent time with lived in buildings that were designated as NORCs, which means that there was a concentration of older adults in this area, and that these were not buildings that were set up as senior living or retirement communities, but over time people lived there and over the decades were aging in place. So this is where the study started, and this is where I was the student in the corner trying to finish her MFA thesis. This is the bakery La Marjolaine where people were first I first came to my attention and on my radar and where I would hang out with them. But the place did close, and so people had to find other options. And so one of the places where they went was McDonald's, and there was a McDonald's a few blocks away. A lot of older adults would go there, and in some ways replicated some of the conditions that the first site gave them in terms of it kind of being an open place. People could spend a lot of time there, but not too much time because there were a lot of signs about loitering and not being able to spend so much time. So it was interesting. It's kind of this open, in some ways very democratic place, but also had restrictions as well. And then there was another kind of a, I would think is like maybe an iconic or kind of a prototypical New York deli called Pete's. And there were just a few tables jammed in the front of this deli. And there were, you know, kind of prohibition, like there was no bathroom. So you could only last so long if you were drinking coffee or soda or something like that. But people were also able to reconvene here as well. So how do people make a home in the city? And I tried to be a little bit sort of not fanciful about it, but I think about kind of the stereotypes that we have about older people, or some of the ways that people were feeling a little self-conscious about the ways that they tried to make their lives. And so I sort of have a play on those in the slide titles to come. So one, if you're going to make a home in the city like the older adults I spend time with, loiter. Find your public living room. And I use this word loiter because at the time, at the end of my research, there was kind of a drama that had erupted in another neighborhood in New York City, Flushing, Queens, where there's a large Asian American population. And so there was this story running in the New York Times about older people who were loitering at this McDonald's. And basically the management called police on them and had them removed. And it became like a saga. And I actually ended up writing a New York Times op-ed about this. This is how my book editor actually found me. So this book comes from that whole drama. If somebody hadn't said, you should write an op-ed about it, I wouldn't have. And so maybe we would have found each other, but I think that that's kind of a cool story. And so there were various conditions that I identified that facilitated access and promoted frequent interaction among this group. So one thing was cost. These people are lower and middle income, and so they didn't have a ton of spending dollars. Their dining dollars were really precious. They're on fixed incomes. And so the bakery and the other places where they were grouped, McDonald's, were hit a price point that they could accommodate. So they were able to afford the place. That was one thing that was really important. And I don't, in the presentation here, there's just so much in this book, and there's some things that I had to leave out. I don't talk a ton about this directly with a capital G, but with gentrification, there were fewer and fewer options to find affordable establishments. Time was really important. And so these people had a lot of time on their hands due to retirement and struggled to fill it sometimes. They had to create these routines. It could be oppressive for some people, not everybody. There was one person, Eugene, a working writer, and he was always busy. And people spoke about his way that he could fill his time with ease as being something that they were really in admiration of and admiring, because it was challenging for them. So they were able to spend a lot of time in these places. They could stay there for hours. They could pop in and out. Actually, now compared with California, I find as a lifelong New Yorker, coffee shops shut down so early. And so even the bakery was like open till 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. The McDonald's was open till 10. This is, of course, before the pandemic had kind of tightened up some hours on places. The location and proximity was really important. It was within, just a few blocks of their front doors. And again, as people were having more and more trouble walking, this was really important. It also was an extension of their living room in a way. It was a public living room. So even for people who didn't have so many mobility issues, they could just kind of pop in from their apartment and like go down for breakfast somewhere and find company. A design was really important. People felt comfortable here, especially in the bakery and the McDonald's. It was accessible for people who had walkers and canes, and they could feel that they could sit down and get cozy. And surveillance was low. So they definitely favored places where they didn't feel like all eyes were on them. There's a part in the book I talk about where they tried to regroup at a diner and they made an arrangement with the owners, because some of them would eat there sometimes. and it didn't work out. They felt like everybody was watching them. There were rules in place. You had to leave it like at least $1 tip. They could only sit in this area from like the quiet hours of like, I don't know, it was like 11 a.m. or something until 2 p.m., but not the lunch rush. So they didn't really like that. Some of the things that people did, which I do too, I mean, this is how I got to know these people. I'm a loiterer as well. Eavesdropping, people watching, sort of being nosy and wanting to know what was going on in the bakery. After it closed, somebody mentioned missing the drama of the place, which I kind of chuckled at because I thought, oh, well, you know, drama like coffee and eating, you know, Hamantaschen didn't seem ripe with drama, but apparently it was. And inserting yourself in the conversation. So that's another facet of daily life that I came to observe. And finally, sharing information and also gathering information about other people was really important. Sharing information, and I'll talk about the ties that they developed a little bit in a few slides, was really key to developing a certain type of intimacy, you know, that they could share their woes, share their problems here. You know, this mutual confiding was really pronounced amongst this group. And then being able to access the place frequently, they were able to observe others and over time gather information that facilitated this mutual confiding and also set the stage for helping when someone ran into a trouble, a problem, a health crisis. So I often think about this group that I spent so much time with. I think about the old Groucho Marx joke. I don't want to belong to any club that would accept me as one of its members. And people definitely were not the joiners, you know, they were not the shut-ins, they were not the people that I wasn't going to find as a researcher, like people who were totally isolated or not out and about. So I wasn't going to see those people. But these, for the most part, weren't the joiners, and I guess I'm not either. So maybe that's how we struck up a rapport. They weren't in the book clubs, they weren't in knitting circles. These were not the heavy senior center attendees, and they weren't heavily involved in spiritual spaces like a church or a synagogue. So thinking about this group that really didn't kind of own itself as a group, let's say, I thought a lot about social identities and the intersections that we hold and age as a category of our identity. And often age is treated as an et cetera category. You know, we have race, ethnicity, gender, and then age, class, you know, all of these other dimensions. And so within the literature, and I think also the way that people thought about themselves, they didn't identify as older people, like this is the main aspect of their identity. And yet age really did come up a lot. Getting older also is a stigmatized identity. And so that didn't exactly promote people to say, you know, I'm an older person, I'm going to own this identity as my primary lens, with I identify my struggles and the life I live. And there was a lot of internalized ageism in addition to externalized ageism. And so one of the women I remember who is really, in gerontology speak, there's a lot of criticism about it, but there's this idea of successful aging, you know, a person that is not only living long, but living many of those years in good physical health, avoiding disease, has the material resources to be able to travel and enjoy a certain kind of life in retirement. And so she was definitely, I think, a model there in some ways. So she would talk about the people at McDonald's, even though she went to McDonald's to socialize with them. She said, oh, that's where the dementia club hangs out. Like those are for those kind of downtrodden older people. And then another gentleman I spent time with, the working writer I had mentioned named Eugene, I asked him, well, do you go to the senior center? Would you go? What do you think about the senior center? And he said, well, I hate old people. Like, I don't want to go to the senior center and play mahjong with them and whatever they do all day. And yet he spent most of his hours in the company of older people. And at this time, he's probably about 86 when he's telling me this. So as the bakery was starting, it was becoming clearer that it was not only threatened, it was going to close. People there started to talk about themselves as a collective. They identified themselves as the bakery club, which I thought was really fascinating. And one of the reasons why was that these people who were kind of talking about each other or older people very negatively, or would distance themselves at times from other patrons. And I talk a little bit more about that, about the relationships that they cultivated. They were finding themselves in a moment where they had this collective need. There was a lot of mourning that went on about the bakery closing, and it had become a really central part of many people's lives. And so they were in a moment of recognizing these shared vulnerabilities, that we are people that need this place. We can only walk so far. We can only afford so much. We depend on this place for socializing, for, uh, humor and kind of, a uplifting part of our day. Um, and I thought about this, and I thought about groups, and I went back to the literature on kind of social groupings. And I'm quite fond of this article by the feminist philosopher Iris Marion Young called Aging as a Series. And she thinks about, she's sort of struggling with, and this is, in the early 90s, thinking about women, and can we talk about women as a group when there's so many different dimensions of identity, where people are not always, or often not, recognizing each other as having similar struggles, in terms of thinking about Black women and white women. And so, but she tries to highlight some situations in which she thinks that a collective can be formed, even if it's time limited or it's ephemeral. And so she returns to the literature on social collectives from Jean-Paul Sartre, and she adapts his concept of a series and uses this example as if, like, okay, can we ever form a group with people? And she draws on this example of people waiting for a bus. People are waiting for a bus, they find themselves there, and the bus does not arrive. And if the bus does not arrive, what do people do? Maybe they're collaborating, they're helping each other, they're identifying, at least we all have this issue right now. Like, we may be of different races, genders, et cetera, but we need this bus to come. And so maybe they break off. Some of them really get rallied up and call the bus company or try to figure it out. Other people may, find the bus comes, they never see each other again, and the sort of series disperses. In other situations, maybe people institutionalize. Now this is going to be their advocacy issue, and they're going to advocate for, public transit rights. So all to say that I saw this situation with the group that I spent time with as kind of this closing, which was, as sad as it was, this opportunity to leverage some of these identities, and at least for that moment, find a moment of solidarity. And in the book, I talk about other situations that might leverage people who are kind of loath to identify in certain issues, like in terms of maybe senior center closings, healthcare, cuts to Medicare, et cetera, where people can say, okay, well, we're older and we're in this kind of social location in which we need to get together and organize. So the relationships that I observed were really fascinating because people were spending time with each other and, gathering information, watching each other, sharing information. But there was a discrepancy between the interactions that I observed and people's reports of their relationships when I talked to them directly in interviews or just conversations. They appeared close, but they would not identify each other as friends. And this posed a puzzle for me. And so I turned to the literature on social networks and social relationships to try to make more sense of this. And so they didn't make friends, but they make what I conceptualize as elastic ties. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But at first, I'd like to kind of back up and point to the landmark article on the strength of weak ties by Mark Granovetter. And he outlines the criteria for what a strong tie is. And I was thinking about this a lot with the relationships I observed when I was trying to figure out what they were, because a lot of the relationships I observed actually fulfilled these criteria for strong ties, which are intimacy, so mutual confiding, spending a lot of time together, reciprocity, so exchanging services, and emotional intensity. And I did see all of these things in the ties that I observed among the bakery patrons. And so that brought me also to some literature thinking about other relationships, categories of relationships between weak and strong. And so I delved into some literature, going back to Simmel and the idea of the stranger as this person that kind of occupies this inside-outside position. The ethnography, wonderful ethnography by Elliot Lee Bow, Tally's Corner, where people were actually accelerating their intimacy. They didn't even know each other's names, but they would like call themselves like, we're going for brothers. They kind of had these kin relationships. Mario Small's wonderful book about daycare centers and kind of the ties that people created among parents in New York City. And then Matt Desmond's work on disposable ties, so people facing eviction and really facing a lot of crises, getting very, very close, and then it kind of, exploding and dissipating. And so in the ties that I observed, there was a simultaneous closeness and distance coexisting in often a single interaction or a social tie. And like a rubber band, that's the kind of image I use to think about this. Elastic ties stretch to accommodate fluidity. You could be close, but then you could distance yourself, and according to the spontaneity of social relationships. So they were flexible. Finally, people had the opportunity to keep their options open, and so they could distance as they needed to. So sometimes situations were overwhelming. Strong ties provide a lot of important support, but they can also be burdensome and expensive. And so they were able to distance if they needed to. So there was that strength and flexibility. And so I'm going to read another passage from the book. And this vignette highlights some of the stresses and burdens of claiming a relationship, as when a popular bakery regular named Dottie had a health crisis that really tested her neighborhood relationships. Dottie's connection with others saved her life the day she suffered a heart attack, more than a year after the bakery closed. When she failed to show up for a birthday party in her building's community room, a neighbor found Dottie collapsed in her apartment. She spent 6 weeks in the hospital, followed by 2 more in a nursing home before she died at 83 years old. Circumstances towards the end of her life mirror health declines that threaten many people's ability to live independently. Before she died, Dottie, her family, and her extended neighborhood network of social ties wrestled with tough questions about her future medical care and living arrangements. At this crossroads, Dottie confronted life-altering losses of physical ability. Her feeble condition worsened while she remained hospitalized indefinitely. When she finally moved to a nursing home, Dottie and her family confronted 3 searing realities amid great uncertainty. The physical consequences of the health crisis and the specter of death loomed first, followed by adjustment to institutional living and its concurrent loss of privacy and control, and finally, the permanent loss of home and neighborhood. Dottie's rapid deterioration tested the strength of people's ties. She received many regular visitors, but not everyone went. Some claimed that their own health problems prevented them. My doctor says I'm not supposed to go into hospital, Sylvia mentioned whenever Dottie's visitors updated the group at Pete's about her condition. Others provided no explanation. Though Phyllis had distanced herself from the McDonald's group, she visited Dottie regularly. Lucy proved one of Dottie's most reliable visitors, but accumulated stresses on her almost daily visits, such as emotional drain and fatigue from skipping dinner and getting home late. Nevertheless, she admitted, it's hard to leave. I have a girlfriend who told me, you're not family. I'm going to time how long you stay there. She's right. Lucy said that Linda, Dottie's only child, compelled her to visit more and stay longer. I try to be there for Linda, but my day is right around the corner. And who's going to be there for me, Lucy said. That she was glad when I visited because she could leave earlier and hypothesized about the other's absence. You know what? We're old people and we don't want to see it because we're getting old. It's scary. They don't want to see what's happening to Dottie. They told me so. They said, we're only going to stay an hour. Phyllis told me this, and Carmen only comes once in a while. Lucy explained how the group interpreted her frequent visits, adding, you know, I'm considered Dottie's best friend. She didn't say whether she or Dottie agreed. So another feature of the interactions that I observed, which really surprised me at first, but really shouldn't have, was that there was a ton of gossip. And so I went to the literature on gossip to think about this a little bit more. And I, like many other researchers, just define gossip as talk in the absence of a third-party subject of discussion. So it doesn't necessarily have to have a negative connotation, but it's happening when the person who is the subject of it isn't aware or not present. Other researchers have found that gossip provides influence, information, entertainment. It can serve as a source of group cohesion, closeness, allows people to socially compare themselves to others and evaluate themselves. And I definitely observed many of these characteristics. And so in this study, gossip provided a point of connection and intimacy, entertainment, and the ability and opportunity to engage in storytelling. It allowed people who maybe kind of stuck with each other at times. You know, they can't really go to too many places, blow off steam, and kind of maintain friendly enough relationships to allow them to continue to go there. Definitely, it delineated certain hierarchies, organized sometimes around cognitive ability, financial resources, etc., and information sharing. And so I'll read a passage that I think illustrates a lot of these features. And it centers on a woman named Teresa who had advancing dementia and became the subject of quite a bit of gossip. Meanwhile, Lucy and Dottie shared their own Teresa stories. They recounted how she had called them multiple times that morning to check the scheduled arrival time for a cable station news crew to cover the bakery's imminent demise. Teresa called Lucy first, saying she wouldn't call Dottie, but later called Dottie twice. On other occasions, Sylvia had offered her own assessment. She's losing it. Eugene agreed. Teresa's in trouble. She doesn't know what day it is. The most glaring incident to indicate Teresa's low standing occurred one busy evening when customers packed 7 of the 8 tables in the bakery. Lucy told me that Teresa had gone to play lotto and promised to come back, but she had left a long time ago and had not returned. So nobody knows where Teresa is, but the group is now going to kind of have a whole big discussion about her whereabouts. She must have gone to Italy, she quipped. Lucy also mentioned that Teresa left her umbrella, pointing to the familiar umbrella with a white handle and clear plastic canopy segments leaning against the wall. Teresa had a special attachment to this item, as I and most everyone else knew that evening. She brought it everywhere, often on clear, blue sky days with no rain forecasted. Flora, another lifelong neighborhood resident, said with character sarcasm, "You know, she loves that umbrella. It's very expensive," she told me. Ha! She curled her lips with condemnation. Her dark eyes narrowed as she recalled how Teresa had refused to loan it briefly to one of the afternoon regulars because of its supposed worth. Everyone commented on Teresa's preoccupation. Usually unflappable, Carmen, who often ate with Teresa and other women at a nearby diner, could not suppress a giggle. Lucy, who also dined with her several evenings a week, laughed and said, "Maybe she thinks she's Mary Poppins. Always with that umbrella," another murmured. Carmen gave a knowing look and pointed out, "And it's not even raining today." People passed around stories about times that Teresa had misplaced her umbrella and panicked. Once she had nearly come unraveled when she couldn't find it at the bakery and searched for it at the diner she frequented a block away and later her apartment. On that evening, she had returned well after the bakery closed to report that she had located it at home after having insisted to Angelica that someone had stolen it. Hearing this tale, Flora inspected the prized umbrella, holding it up for the store's audience and showing off its dark blue logo from a chic hotel that betrayed its history as a promotional giveaway. "This isn't expensive," Flora scoffed. "She got it for free," she said, twirling the umbrella like a baton before setting it down. About 10 minutes after the closing, the crowd gone for the night, Teresa returned to retrieve her umbrella. "Where is everybody?" she asked. "Do you know where they went?" "Oh, I guess they went home," Angelica, the counter person, replied. "Oh," Teresa said, her lean face heavy with disappointment. And so talking about Teresa allowed her peers to joke at her expense and entertain themselves, invoke humor and storytelling. But this form of gossip also helped delineate a local hierarchy that assured that as long as they weren't the subject of gossip like Teresa and rampant discussion, that they had not fallen to the bottom. But the story is more complicated than simply disparaging or cutting down somebody. Others talked about her, but they also kept track of her, and they looked out for her as her dementia worsened to the point where she couldn't live on her own anymore, and she had to go move closer to family in New Jersey. Um, as much as they were frustrated with her and often talked about this, they never cast her out, and they continued to accommodate her participation in interactions. And when they moved, or when Teresa moved, they made repeated attempts to get in touch with her brother. And so over several years of decline, keeping her in the fold of these bakery interactions may have prevented her from losing her independence earlier. So people often complained about the other older people as griping all day about their aches and pains. You know, I don't want to hear all this stuff about death, aches and pains, but they actually were able to leverage a lot of informed opinions about their care and consult with other people when they would come to a place like the bakery and engage in kind of analysis of a doctor's appointment that they just had, which may have been rushed, it may have been stressed, they may have not, really understood the directions from the doctor. Many of them experienced ageism in these healthcare interactions and poor treatment. So they were able to gain some comfort and support by talking about that in these other places. And so using third places to process this dissatisfaction and these demoralizing experiences really provided an important venue for people who may not have had so many opportunities for care, and really played a big part of their healthcare decisions. And having these other sites that serve older adults, but also put older adults at a higher likelihood of experiencing ageism and age stigma provided, again, another venue for people that could have been more isolated because they dislike socializing only with other old people. So in institutional settings that are age segregated, such as senior centers. So they had somewhere to go. And finally, I'm going to read the last passage. And this vignette highlights some of the dissatisfaction and resignation that two participants, Eugene and Sylvia, experienced as they talked about their healthcare experiences while they were at Pete's. Managing the body often involved talking about it, and almost every conversation contained on-ramps to discussing the body and health. Visits to healthcare sites loomed large in most people's lives, especially those with multiple chronic illnesses. Some received primary care at one of two clinics located a few blocks from their homes, including one devoted to geriatric care or geriatric medicine. But many also traveled outside of the neighborhood, especially for specialized medical care. When someone gave a play-by-play account after returning from an appointment, regulars often joined in the post-game analysis. These interactions provided a chance to vent their own frustrations and compare health problems. After Eugene returned from the Veterans Affairs Hospital's geriatric clinic, along with medical updates, he always came armed with stories about how the staff had condescended to him. His accounts gave people the opportunity to opine about his treatment and share their experiences. He voiced his distaste for the protocol that staff followed to assess his physical status and mental acuity. They asked him if he could tell them the day of the week and to explain how he traveled to the clinic on his own. Once they took their assessment further, they removed Eugene's shoes and asked him to demonstrate that he could put them back on without assistance. Afterwards, Eugene wrote a complaint letter to the VA hospital director and received a written apology. When I go to the doctor, it's always the same thing. What day is it? Here are three objects: an apple, a dog, an airplane, Eugene imitated in a sing-song falsetto. Then they walk away and they quiz you later. Do you know how many times I've drawn a clock with its hands at 10 of 12? Oh yes, I hate that one. When they leave you sitting there and walk away, Sylvia said of the first cognitive assessment. And what if you forget one of those things? What then? She shuddered. And the other one, where they write the letters, that's a tough one. She described another of these tests, her pejorative term, in which a doctor instructed her to close her eyes while he traced an alphabet letter on her open palm, then asked her to identify the mystery letter. Here, like this, she said when I asked her to demonstrate. She traced the outline of an alphabet letter on my open palm while I kept my eyes closed. I flunked, unable to identify the mystery letter. What was it? I asked. Q. Well, here's the deal, Eugene continued. What I don't understand is if they want to make sure I'm not senile, why don't they discuss current events with me? Ask me what's going on in the world, or if I've read the newspaper. I'm the author of over 50 books. Sylvia confessed that these tests made her nervous and that she also hated them. But what choice do I have? They need to check for certain things, she said, knocking on the table to ward off ill fortune and looking up at the ceiling or to a God she admitted doubting existed. Eugene rolled his eyes. Well, I don't have to take it, he said, raking his fingers under his chin and flicking them in his favorite defiant gesture, which he directed at reckless drivers, condescending medical personnel, and anyone else who disrespected him or pissed him off. I don't like to make waves, Sylvia cautioned. She invoked the same phrase when talking about her building management, another entity that could jeopardize her physical and emotional security if rocked the wrong way. She was a vocal proponent of following doctors' orders, even when skeptical of the message. She also encountered ageism during medical appointments and claimed that elders receive dismissive treatment when they see that number on the form, when you get above a certain number. So a few main takeaways I guess I'd like to highlight, and I'm probably missing a few. Over the course of this research, I really came to understand and appreciate how home is more than four walls, of your apartment or your house, and that third places provide crucial spaces for social support, especially people facing multiple vulnerabilities and in light of increasing diversity and shifting demographics, as we are having fewer, let's say, lifelong relationships. We may, go in and out of different partnerships, not be partnered. So I think that this is more important than ever to really appreciate these under-recognized spaces for social support. Excuse me. The ties outside of weak and strong, so elastic ties or however you may want to term them, are an under-recognized and potentially untapped form of support. I remember when I was thinking about these relationships, so the General Social Science Survey has a question about important matters, and this is an important kind of mechanism to gauge people's close relationships. And so they'll ask, over the last couple months, who are the people that you would discuss important matters with? And thinking about those kind of survey measures with my group, I would doubt that anybody, and I did ask people this question too, and it didn't come up. They were not naming the people that they spent so much time with, but yet it is an important way for them to meet their needs for connection, to not be isolated, and also preserve autonomy. Finally, if we live long enough, we all arrive at our inevitable place. And this book and the journey of writing this book has really made me think about what place is, whether it's the place that you arrive in a temporal way in the life course, a physical place where you find community, you spend your time, or a place that we arrive to mentally, so an emotional, cognitive, or feeling realm. But few are prepared. And I'm quite fond of the work by Pamela Hurd and Donald Moynihan on administrative burdens and looking at all of the ways that it's just so difficult to access vital services, for older adults navigate the Medicaid maze, the Medicare maze, or access, let's say, food, SNAP benefits when they are entitled. So I think that those are things that are all really important to think about as we're getting older, and I'm finding I have less energy to navigate all these systems of support. So if I had a magic wand, there are many things that I would like to do, but my key recommendations, I'll just focus on 3 points. I think strengthening our social infrastructure, which can be public or kind of semi-public places. So investing in small businesses as well is really important. And, as we've seen, post-pandemic, it's been very distressing to have all of these vacant, storefronts open up. And then of course, building businesses that are pushed out of business and then they kind of remain empty for years. So I didn't talk a lot about this, but, people in the urban space have spent a lot of time thinking about residential eviction, but also commercial gentrification and the displacement of neighborhood businesses really affects longtime residents who they may have some secure, affordable housing, but the world around them changes. And so they feel more estranged and kind of almost a social eviction. That's how I came to think about some of the discussions that people had. They would talk about, well, I'm at McDonald's now, but I hope I don't get evicted, from the next place. So it was very poignant to hear that, even though they may have had secure housing. So on the matter of housing, a substantial investment in housing that is affordable, accessible, safe, climate resistant, and supportive for older adults is crucial, but also for people of all ages, incomes, and ability. And so, I think about aging and the life course. It's not just when you get to the later ends, if you're lucky enough, but everything that we do earlier on. And so many of these people were able to have that secure housing earlier in their life that enabled them, at least most of them, some stability in their later life. And finally, we have a long-term care crisis. And so bolstering the range of supports for people who want to age in place, which is, off the charts. It's always 80% of people, even more so since the pandemic and with the devastation that raced through, care facilities, nursing homes. People want to stay in the community, but they might need a little extra help. And so boosting that care infrastructure and support and pay for, paid workers who are, in dire straits in terms of earning a living wage, and supporting unpaid care workers such as family is also crucial if we're going to live longer and also live well. So thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate that, and I look forward to your questions.
I have good questions for people who have watched this, but I guess I'll start with myself. There's one thing, since you're at a medical facility and we associate this with health outcomes, or at least different kinds of health issues. One of the things that there's strength about it is we understand how these people actually find a sense of home. But one of the things that's missing is what it affects in terms of health outcomes. And what's missing about it is we don't have the counterfactual in terms of people who are not associating with this.
Yeah, no, I didn't find the shut-in. So the Collier brothers, in their apartments locked down.
Well, we know from Kleinenberg who you do know, that the other side of this has an effect. So, or it did in actually emergency. So, is in order to find the health outcomes, is the next project having to do with the shut-ins?
Well, that's really interesting. And well, in a way, I would say not exactly, but so I've been finally, I have somebody who, if it's not going to be an ethnography, I certainly want to write about his life. I made a friend basically with somebody I thought was going to be a research participant who lives in San Francisco and is dealing with a lot of different issues that I'm interested in around mental illness, addiction, houselessness. So he's technically homeless and has been dealing with all of these different things. And over time, with my colleagues at UCSF who are more entrenched in some of these spaces, talking to psychiatrists and other practitioners in the community, it is really challenging for a lot of people who are in the social location that I'm interested to access these kind of spaces, so a lot of people are just very isolated. But that said, I'm really interested in some of the spaces, like in terms of supporting housing, where there might be like a lobby where people are able to kind of hang out. I'm very interested in the SROs in the Tenderloin, and a lot of them have a space, or actually people create space on the street. Like if you go on 6th Street, you see people who have they're sitting there in their rolling walkers, and they're kind of still trying to do that. So I guess I would say maybe the next project would be people who are slightly more have even greater challenges, but also because I want to find them, probably I would still be looking at the people that are able to still kind of find some other source of connection, whether it's through, like something like an AA group, something like a workplace, something like even like a street corner where they're able to kind of find a group of people. It's interesting because I haven't gone to church for 2 decades. And with this this sort of friend slash research participant, he had to go to a 90-day program last year. So he did, and it was right around the corner from a church. And so I've been going to church with him to try to understand this part of his life. And it's a really fascinating space because it's like very, they say they're intergenerational, but I am one of the older people there, okay? And I'm almost 45 and my friend's 50. So we're definitely on the older end of things, very young. A lot of people work in tech. And so this person has like different, different people in his life. Like one of his friends from church now is like owns a building in San Francisco and works at Google. Like I don't even have a friend that owns a building and works at Google. So it's really a fascinating thing. So we'll see.
This question comes from Megan Paul, who asks, from your research, how might these isolation questions occur within and affect other vulnerable urban populations, such as teens? Are there shared third spaces across these vulnerable groups from your observations?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, I want to point out Claude Fisher's work in UC Nets, which has been really instrumental, I think, in really trying to gauge some of those ties, and a very extensive interview protocol asking about people's interactions in different spaces. So I definitely want to recognize his work. One of the things I didn't get to talk about, and I didn't study heavily, I would have liked to pay more attention to and actually had talked to the young people, but McDonald's was a space that really reminded me of Arlie Hochschild's work in The Unexpected Community, where she talks about, kind of some of the issues with older people and younger people coming some similarities in terms of needing to find space, a time in your life where you're not maybe heavily as entrenched in working or having a family of your own in the same way. And so at this McDonald's, there was competition for space among the older people and the younger people. And there was a whole thing where you had to go, in order to go to the back part of McDonald's, it was like a fancy nightclub. You had like this, rope, and you had to show your tray and your receipts in order to access it. And so younger people were there too. But the funny thing was, there was sometimes moments of conflict, but there were also moments of appreciation, at least going from the older people to the younger people, because some of the older people chose to sit closer to where the younger people were. Like they felt it was a livelier environment. And when they had their school breaks and they weren't there after school, they missed the young people. So I think there are definitely places that we can think of where these challenges come up across different age groups. And I think it is very challenging for younger people too. Like in the media recently, there were a couple articles about places that are not, like restaurants that are not serving people under 30 or under a certain age. And so I don't want to discount that ageism can also happen at younger ages for sure.
I was curious, did most of the research participants, were they in rent control buildings? Is that how they were able to stay? Because of course that's such a contentious issue here in California.
I know, and I feel actually rent control is much more robust here in California, just in my conversations with people who live in San Francisco and rent control apartments. I saw something in the Chronicle recently or somewhere, it was like, I don't know, like 2/3 or 60-something% of people in San Francisco are living in rent controlled apartments, or at least renters. So for the most part, the way that people were able to hang on to their secure, affordable housing in this neighborhood was that they either lived in public housing projects, and so they weren't like a rent controlled renter in a sort of independent building. They were in a complex, or in these low equity co-ops that were set up by unions in the 60s. So it was affordable housing. They actually like owned their apartment, but basically if they wanted to ever sell it, they wouldn't sell it for market rate. They weren't going to like sell it for $1 million. It would only be what they paid in. So it would only be like a few $1,000s. You did have people that were in rent controlled and rent stabilized apartments, a few of them in these market rate buildings. And they were the most vulnerable. And I don't talk about it in the presentation, but in the book, Eugene, the working writer, was basically dragged down to housing court in sort of a quasi eviction proceeding at the age of 85. And he was actually paying his rent, but he was paying like $900 something for a studio apartment in Manhattan. And so there was a lot of allegations that were unfounded about the condition of his apartment. And there was another woman, Sylvia, who was in a rent control apartment and said that actually when she moved in, because in New York you have rent control and rent stabilization, so they're different programs. Rent control, my understanding is it ended about 1974, those apartments. So she was actually pointed by the person who rented her apartment, said, take this apartment, this is a rent controlled apartment in the 70s versus this rent stabilized, which has some protections, but not as many. So that's really, they were for the most part not, and the tragedy in New York City has been so many apartments being taken off of rent stabilization, and then they're just lost.
I have a couple more questions if
Sure.
from the audience. I have two, so you might have to note.
I might have to get the pen out. Try.
One is you talk about geography. So I'm really interested in generalization to people getting old in a city. And your city is quite a unique city. And if I could think of Los Angeles, which is a horizontal city, or many of them like that, the question of concentration would never be there. And so the generalization about this notion of community would be stretched, and the behavior is different. That's one.
Yeah.
The second has to do from my own research on neighborhoods and institutions, that there's a real big difference between a neighborhood institution and what I called an enterprise. And the issue there is whether if you're not able to, if the enterprise is not allowing you to stay in that area, you have a hard time connecting. But from your data sense is like they still connect, but in those places that made them go, it would have made much more difficult for that to occur, of course. And last, related to that, has to do with the idea is what would these people have done since you mentioned that it goes out of business? What are these people like once that's gone then? So that's your central place. Where is this reproduced?
Yeah, really interesting, good questions. I actually just spent some time in Los Angeles in the fall, and it was mostly in the downtown area, which was very interesting because I had, for a quick moment, I had a boyfriend that lived in downtown LA without a car, and I'm a New Yorker, I don't know how to drive. So I was like, how did you do that? Basically he worked like 8 blocks away from his office, and he was able to kind of hang with some of the elements around there. So, but thinking about the wider, at least spread out areas, or someplace like Arizona, I have a sister who lives outside of Phoenix, and that's a lot of older people who can like to retire there. It's really challenging, and I think that the key thing in those situations is one, driving. Once you lose your ability to drive, you're really losing your independence. And this older man I mentioned, Eugene, in the book, he had a standing offer to go live with his sister in Dallas, and he was like, they would have to drive me everywhere. I would completely lose my independence. And so I think that definitely challenges. There's definitely different situation than New York City with its urban density and the ability to kind of walk and find places not so far from home. The other thing is, I think, gaining entree into socializing with other people at their houses. I just did a book talk like a week and a half ago in Sacramento, and it was interesting. I'd never really been there. And somebody was mentioning, like they had been in Sacramento for a couple years and they felt very isolated and lonely. And they were middle-aged, so closer to my age. And they said, and then I realized there's this whole network of people, socializing in their backyards and their houses. But that said, I do think that there is still a thirst for having these other spaces that are accessible. And I remember when I had this New York Times op-ed about McDonald's, I got so many interesting notes from people around the country who would say, like we're in Iowa and we're farmers and we actually go drive to this McDonald's. And so even though it's more far flung, I do think that there is this thirst to have another space that's outside of sort of an institutional space and outside of the family space. In terms of thinking about that neighborhood institution and the enterprise and what happens if you have to leave, I don't know if I have excellent answers, but it reminds me of, growing up in New York City, My ex-husband grew up in the Lower East Side, and that's a neighborhood at that time that was heavily like on Second Avenue, Ukrainian, Polish people around. And more of those people had left due to gentrification or maybe social mobility. Their kids had become more social, able to get a house somewhere in Queens. But there's this church on, I think it's 7th Street, called St. Stanislaus. And people would continue to commute back to this church every week and somehow, continue that community, even though many of them were not living there anymore. And so I think there was a third element, which I'm kind of losing track of, but when the business is gone, how do you reproduce these places? I think at least for my small group that I spent time with, it comes down to like identifying these conditions, where are the places where you can, definitely relations changed. And one of the things that people disliked was having to be more intentional with their gatherings. Like they had to now call and see, is somebody going to be around? Or somebody who is having, more and more health problems and couldn't even walk the extra block and a half, had to coordinate with people because she even needed help getting in and out of a taxi. And so that definitely was something that people disliked and that had changed some. But there were still places like that McDonald's and the deli where people could still find enough of the elements of this open space. And then once people were going there, they would say, okay, probably somebody else will be there. So they knew they wouldn't be all alone. And I think, it's like me as a person that works a lot from home. Like I think I'm an expert now in identifying the coffee shops that work for me, but I don't want to go to one that's like completely empty and like nobody's there, because then I'm like, well, I could just be in my kitchen and be alone.
Question?
Yes.
So I'm sorry I missed the earlier part. So I assume you kind of referenced this part like Oldenburg's third space.
Yes, yes.
But I was also trying to connect that with that sense of both urban spaces and also kind of the intergenerational work, which I haven't read your book, so.
No worries. It just came out 2 weeks ago. It's just born.
But I'm wondering how these kind of movements, like intergenerational kind of movements that I'm starting to become more aware of, are flowing into urban spaces and how they connect in third spaces.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm not sure exactly what intergenerational movements you might be talking about. I'm thinking about like sometimes some of these protests that are happening, social movements where older people and younger people are coming together, like around climate changes for one. And so in some ways, that's not exactly a third space. People might be gathering, but still they had to kind of commit to like, we're interested in thinking about this issue together. So I think in terms of intergenerational, I talk about this in the conclusion, thinking about, how we might redesign or reimagine our spaces or make them more inclusive for people who don't necessarily want to be age segregated, because it's a big feature of American society. It's like we're going to school, we're like divided up into grades, and then we have this part of our life, and there's still a lack of contact, I think, between different age groups at a certain point. Maybe in the workplace there's a little bit more. And I think one of the things that sort of a trend around the world is trying to co-locate, like for instance, a nursery school or a pre-K, like a daycare center and a senior center, and try to get some exchange going there, which I think definitely has its pluses, but I think it's also not enough to physically just put the door of the daycare center next to the door of the senior center isn't going to facilitate that interaction. And so making spaces where people can just feel like they can access it, but not be in a certain role. I think the challenge too is what I sort of dislike is, if this sort of, I think the spirit should really be of exchange. And I in some of the research that I've seen or some of the programs that I've sort of come across, it seems like, these older people basically are downtrodden and they need like the young people to uplift them and like, cheer them up or something. I'm definitely not a fan of those models.
I'm going to give you 2 questions.
Okay.
Because we're running.
All right, try to be quick.
So,
Thank you.
One is from Helen Ho, who comments, I immediately thought of Portsmouth Square in San Francisco, Chinatown. Question, how can community organizations and or governments create more third spaces that would be great loitering spaces for older adults. That's one. And the second is from another person. What kinds of things would you recommend that people under 65 could do individually and collectively in order to remain independent and connected as they grow older? Anything you can add to your recommendations in your talk?
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, well, San Francisco has so many lovely spaces, but it requires upkeep, maintenance, and investment. And so I think in terms of thinking about parks or centers or libraries, like we're in a time of, budget cuts, and there's so much uncertainty at all different levels about how to pay for these things. And so I think one thing that I'm very concerned about too is making sure that there are spaces in all sorts of areas and all sorts of neighborhoods, and also having the public transportation to get to those spaces. That's something that I didn't mention, is if you were in a place that is a little bit more far flung and you don't drive, or you just don't have that ability, to be able to bolster the ability to get there as well. And so I just think, again, having to intentionally prioritize these spaces. It's not just a park or a tree or some kind of amenity that's nice to look at, that it's really important for health and connection and community, and sort of a form of preventative care. Like, okay, I mean, I did read a study some years ago about it, especially at the height of the pandemic, like, oh, like looking at trees, like just be looking at trees helps, up your mental health. So I would go out in the backyard and, like, okay, I might have a million emails that I'm buried under, but I need to go look at this tree right now or my head's going to explode. I would also like to highlight that I think there's a lot of, inequity in spaces. And so I think of where I live in Oakland, and there are some spaces that are available, but there's really a shortage of parks. And so, the sad thing is, with all these sort of empty lots and vacant storefronts, if we could do something to create, a space or a center for people, I'm all in favor of that. In terms of what we can do at our younger ages to remain, I guess, connected, and to support each other collectively. I think one of the things that so I'm a person that's not tech savvy, as Max knows, who helped me, get set up with this talk. Thank you. I don't even have a smartphone. And I think the discussions we're having about the way that we are connecting digitally are important. I'm not here to sell anybody on my low tech lifestyle necessarily, but I do think that some of the reports coming out about how it is really challenging, especially for younger people, is something that we need to pay attention to. And I know some schools have been instituting cell phone bans. I don't come down one way or the other, but I think at least having this conversation and realizing that we have to kind of take inventory of our digital diet, as long with the things that we eat every day,